sometimes it's very difficult to leave the abusive spouse. So even though you are in an abusive situation, you may actually be still living with your abusive spouse. So what the VAWA petition allows you to do is actually file with a different address, which you normally cannot do with immigration petitions. You have to actually put in your physical address where you are. But this allows you to have your petition diverted elsewhere so that your abusive spouse doesn't find out about it, because that can be a reason for the escalation of violence against the abused spouse.
Welcome to So Where Are You From? I'm your host, Nooshin, Bagheri, a first-generation Iranian-American by identity and an immigration attorney by profession. Today we have Ms. Fakiha Khan, an attorney and founding member of Noor Family Services. I have known Fakiha back in college, but then many years passed until we met again. And that time came when I was recommended for and then served for 2 years as a board member of the nonprofit organization Noor Family Services. Noor Family Services is an extraordinary organization assisting people who are victims of domestic violence, and the majority of their cases are in assisting immigrant victims. I hope today's episode sheds light behind the curtain of what domestic violence victims go through, especially immigrant victims, and how they can receive the help they need to get out. Welcome, Fakiha, and thank you so much for sitting down with me to help spread and share the facts and resources for those who are victims of domestic violence. But first, so where are you from?
Well, that's a really complicated question. Let's start off with, I grew up in Atlanta. That's my favorite answer. I grew up in Atlanta, but I'm originally from Pakistan, but I was born in Saudi Arabia. Oh. And spent my childhood in Pakistan until I moved to Atlanta, and I've been here for a really long time. Okay. With a segue in New York.
With a what segue? A middle segue in New York?
Yeah. Scored a little break and went to New York and lived there for a little bit, and then I'm back in Atlanta. So I guess I'm an Atlanta girl. That was a really long answer.
No, that's what I love. That's why I ask it. I wish it was always a simple answer, but it's not, because now how the world is so intertwined, it's not just one spot where someone is anymore, There's so much that makes us who we are. So one thing I really want to ask about, what made you decide to take on this endeavor of starting a nonprofit organization, and why did you specifically make one to serve this type of clientele?
Right. Well, you would think that there was a lot of thought that went into starting this project. There really wasn't, to be honest with you. The way it started off is that I had a pretty big tragedy happen in my life, and that is actually what forced me to come back to Atlanta. And once I came back to Atlanta, I just didn't really quite know what to do with myself. And the thing that kept sort of going through my head was something my husband used to say to me. He was like, you have these credentials, you have this education, you should try to help people, and he always encouraged me to help whoever I could when I could. And so when I came down here, I was like, well, what can I do that sort of gives meaning to my life for right now and keeps me busy enough to where I don't just fall apart every day. And I decided to heed my late husband's advice and help people. And so I started reaching out to different organizations, starting with Raksha, actually, which is, the domestic violence organization sort of dedicated towards the South Asian community. And so I reached out to the executive director of Raksha, Aparna, and she was lovely. And I said, hey, do you have any legal cases that I can help with? I'm here to help. Give me something to do. So she referred me to a couple of other organizations as well. And through those organizations and through Raksha, I started doing the pro bono legal work. And at the same time, around the same time, a friend of a friend connected me with Shama Ibrahim. And the first time I met Shama, she started talking about how she had been working at a domestic violence shelter in Forsyth County. And one of the things that really bothered her was when Muslim women or Arab women specifically sort of came in to a domestic violence shelter, and they felt really isolated because a lot of people didn't understand the cultural and religious norms that they had sort of didn't quite connect with why they needed to cover up or didn't respect their specific boundaries. And they were very frustrated and they felt isolated. And it was, in her anecdotal experience, something that was forcing these abused women from going back to their husbands. And she said to me, we just need to do something. We need to have an organization that helps victims of domestic violence who come from other countries, who come from different cultures and religions, who don't have that support network, who don't have people who really understand their specific plight or understand what it means when they say, I need to do my ablutions, and they don't feel, questioned or isolated when they have to wake up at 4 a.m. to, eat breakfast before they start fasting for the day. So it just it was like a meeting of the stars in that moment where I did the legal work and she was kind of really wanting to do support services for victims of domestic violence from within the Muslim community is really where it started off. And so I thought about it and I was like, maybe we just need to do it. Maybe we just need to have an organization that really focuses specifically on DV victims within some of these marginalized communities that don't have support otherwise. And so I called her up. I said, hey, meet me for lunch at Panera. And we met and I was like, let's do it. Let's just do it. Let's create this organization. And literally that's where it started off, was over lunch at French onion soup at Panera. Started off. So there wasn't really a whole lot of thought that went into it, but we did spend about a year sort of developing the structure and how the organization was going to look and, how we were going to put our minds together and really work within our own community.
That is amazing. Sometimes you just have to jump into and take that leap of faith. Like the more you think about it, the more you're not going to do it. But that's amazing. That's really cool. So there's always a conception of domestic violence just being in the form of physical abuse. Can you please describe the other forms that some people don't consider to be domestic violence, but actually is?
Sure. And I think that part of it is just the name domestic violence, right? It implies violence. And we think of violence as something that is physical. It is somebody doing a violent act against someone. But violence is a much broader term, really. You can have violence that is not quite physical touch. And in fact, that is much more prevalent, not to say that, we don't have a wide prevalence of physical violence, but the emotional abuse is really where it begins. So if you talk to people who work within the domestic violence field, they'll talk about the power and control wheel. Because at the end of the day, domestic violence is really about power and control. It is one person who has power and another person who doesn't have as much power. And so the one who has power is really trying to maximize that power and that control. And they do it little by little. And it often starts off with what may seem very minor to somebody outside of the relationship, where it may be, possessiveness as we look at it from the outside. Oh, you can't talk to this person, or why are you talking to that guy, or why are you dressing like this? And it becomes increasingly more controlling from there. So a lot of the non-physical violence is going to be about that assertion of control. It will look like control over who you meet with, who you talk to, what you wear,
finances,
what your role is within the relationship. But beyond that, it's also financial control. A lot of people don't realize what impact that can have on someone. So even if somebody was financially independent walking into a relationship, if that financial independence is eroded over a period of time, that person is now dependent on their abuser. And so they don't have the ability to leave. And in our case, and a lot of the victims that we work with, there are children. And when you have children, you have to be able to feed them. And when you are completely financially reliant on someone, it becomes very difficult. So financial abuse is there, where basically the abusive spouse is controlling all of the money, controlling all of the bills, and the other spouse is completely reliant on them. There is something very unique that we see within, well, I don't know that it is that unique actually, but I suppose I correct myself because we work with a lot of Muslim clientele. I don't know that it is unique to Muslims. I think it may actually exist in other communities. We just don't have that contact. But religious abuse. Religious abuse is where basically the abusive spouse is going to isolate an individual from their religious community, tell them that, you are going to go to hell because you are no longer doing what is expected of you from a religious perspective, right? Your duty to me, your duty to submit yourself to me is something that comes from religion, which we know is not true. But when you're in a relationship where you're constantly being told and that is being reinforced over and over again, it becomes a very powerful tool of control.
Wow, that's the first time I'm hearing of that part, religious abuse. That's very interesting.
Yes. So yes, religious abuse where, and it's very connected to actually a form of sexual abuse as well, where there will be, I'm sure you've heard of revenge porn, for example, where one partner will have pictures or videos that they have taken in intimate situations and they use them against the other partner.
Wow.
That happens within domestic abuse where you have marriages as well. And particularly when you come from a very religious community, that in itself is an incredibly powerful thing. Wow. Where you're saying, well, I have these pictures or videos of you. I'm going to show everybody what a horrible, promiscuous person you are, and I'm going to besmirch your reputation, which again, coming from a very insular community, that can be a really powerful threat. So we have religious abuse that absolutely happens. Immigration abuse is actually another, where you'll have a spouse who has legal status within the United States, and they will marry someone and tell them that, I'm going to go ahead and adjust your status. I'm going to make sure that you have legal status here as well, but ultimately hold that over the other person's head. And say, basically using it to control them. Again, another tool of control where you're saying, well, I'm not going to file this paperwork, or I'm going to call immigration and tell them this or that. And we see that happen all the time in DV situations. So basically, when one spouse is trying to abuse, and I say spouse, but what I mean is partner, where one partner is really trying to control the other partner, they'll use whatever tools they have at hand, whether it's money or it's immigration or it's religion or it's society or it's their hands and their feet.
So in regards to the immigration abuse, that process, there is a process that they can find relief. That person that's being abused can find relief through the VAWA process. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that is where, like you say, the legal resident here in the U.S., U.S. citizen or green card holder is threatening the immigrant that I am not going to process your process. I'm going to report you to ICE. I'm going to get you deported. But this process, this immigration process called VAWA, allows them to petition on their own without their spouse knowing because of this abuse. Can you explain more about that and how, do you see a lot of those type of clienteles since you deal with a lot more immigrant clienteles?
So, I'm going to answer your second question first.
Okay.
When I did immigration work, so I am no longer working, in the capacity of representing private clients. When I did that work, yes, we saw immigration abuse quite a bit, and it was a real problem. Having said that, I don't do that kind of work as much anymore, but it continues to be a problem, and there are a lot of great attorneys and organizations out there who do that kind of work. Having said that, so the USCIS does in fact have not just one but two different procedures for victims of domestic violence. The first procedure is a little less known. It is a U visa, and it is helpful for people who don't already have, who may not have entered legally, for example. So if they have entered without inspection, a U visa is a good way to go. What the way the U visa works is that it is for victims of crime, of specific kinds of crimes, domestic violence being one of them. If they are the victim of a crime and they assist law enforcement with investigation and ultimate prosecution of the abuser, they can qualify for a U visa, which will give them the ability, that sort of foundation to eventually have legal status. That process does have a numerical cap on it. It is also difficult in that you are reliant on law enforcement to assist you.
Yeah.
So you do, part of the paperwork that is involved in that is that you have to get certification from either a judge or a prosecutor or an officer that you are assisting with that prosecution. So it puts that burden on the victim, not just to apply, but also to assist in the prosecution of their abuser, which can be rather difficult if you come from more insular communities where there is just this inherent suspicion of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, that process does exist. The more frequently used process is the I-360 petition, the VAWA petition, which an abused spouse can use. But it is only for spouses, right? They can self-petition. So generally speaking, if you are reliant on your spouse, who is either a U.S. citizen or a green card holder, they would have to apply for you. They would have to petition for you to be able to get status within the United States. What the VAWA petition allows you to do is to petition for yourself without their involvement.
Yeah.
It's got some built-in protections because one of the things that abusive spouses will do is try to call immigration. They'll call immigration and say, I'm withdrawing my affidavit of support, or, oh, this person only married me for fraud. Mm-hmm. So what the VAWA petition does is that if they try to call USCIS is not going to pay any attention to what has been said because the victim is protected, because they know that this is one of the ways that the abusive spouse will
and also not having the documents that typically is needed to, process, because sometimes those victims can't get those documents from the abusive spouse.
That is true. That is also true. So another protection within the VAWA petition is that because you don't have to petition with your spouse, you can actually, again, let me go back just slightly. Sometimes it's very difficult to leave the abusive spouse. Mm-hmm. So even though you are in an abusive situation, you may actually be still living with your abusive spouse. So what the VAWA petition allows you to do is actually file with a different address, which you normally cannot do with immigration petitions. You have to actually put in your physical address where you are. But this allows you to have your petition diverted elsewhere so that your abusive spouse doesn't find out about it, because that can be a reason for the escalation of violence against the abused spouse. The way this petition works is that essentially you have a few things that you have to establish. One is that you're actually married and that you cohabitated with your abusive spouse. That abusive spouse has to either be a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident. If you're the child of an abusive U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you can also self-petition. But you can actually self-petition if you're the abused parent as well. Mm-hmm. You just can't do it if you're the abused parent of a legal permanent resident. So if you're the abused parent of a
U.S. citizen,
you can also use the VAWA petition. So you do have to establish that relationship. You have to establish the abuse, obviously. Now, the type of abuse we're talking about is, it says batterer or extreme
cruelty.
That doesn't mean that it has to be just physical violence. It can actually be based on pervasive emotional violence or psychological threats, assault, basically threatening with physical violence. The problem is with how do you document that, right? So that is a problem for a lot of people, is that it's easier to document the physical abuse because there are scars. You can take pictures of bruises. You can file a police report. You can get a temporary protective order. When it comes to the non-physical violence, it is sometimes harder to prove. But that is the requirement. You do have to prove the abuse. You have to prove the relationship. You have to write a statement on your own behalf, sort of outlining what that abuse was and why you need to self-petition. And then there are other sort of documentation that goes into it. A Along with the I-360, you can actually file at the same time an adjustment of status application and an application for work authorization. The VAWA petition does take a very long time to process.
I think we're at 3 years. The last time I saw, I think it's up to 3 years.
Yeah, it can take up to 3 years to fully. But because you can submit the adjustment of status and work authorization at the same time, even while the petition is processing, once you get that prima facie, I have established the basic premises for a VAWA petition, you can get that work authorization. So while it's pending, you at least have the ability to earn an income.
Yeah.
And you have the ability to at least be able to take care of your dependents and whatnot, and be able to become financially independent of your abuser. So there's no requirement that you have to stay with the abuser the entire time. There's no requirement that you have to stay married the entire time this is processing. I think the folks at USCIS recognize that the dynamics of an abusive relationship can be very dynamic.
Yeah.
They can change a lot over time. So that is all sort of built into that process.
Are there any misconceptions of those who are victim of domestic violence? Like, I guess, is there like perceived like notion, like for example, we always go back to, domestic violence just considered physical abuse or someone that just kind of cries wolf. Is there any like misconceptions when you talk to these victims?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, there are misconceptions. I think they're just misconceptions about abuse, period, right? I think people do not realize that abuse is a cycle, that it is something that doesn't necessarily initiate with physical violence, that it is something that can crescendo, and physical violence is the top of that crescendo. Mm-hmm. I think there is that misconception about how abuse really works.
It's like a grooming process too. It's a grooming process.
Yeah, absolutely. Another misconception that I think a lot of people have of DV is that once you leave your abuser, the abuse stops.
Yeah, no.
And that is absolutely not true. The cycles, the relationship that has enmeshed because of that abuse is actually very difficult to separate out. So even after there has been a physical separation of the abusive relationship, that cycle of abuse can still continue, because people who are abusive tend not to change their spots, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to get out of those patterns. Another thing I would say, a misconception, is that an abused spouse is never going to stand up for themselves, or they never do. I think it sometimes really surprises people that an abused spouse can attempt to stand up for themselves, and sometimes it just creates more violence, to be really honest, when that happens. But it's very difficult for people to understand, because we tend to think in black and white. This person is the bad person, and this person is the good person, and they're the victim, and they're always the victim. And we have this sort of misperception of what a victim looks like. Yes. It is this idealized version of a victim. But they're not just victims. They're survivors, and they're survivors who have dynamic personalities, and, who are multifaceted, and their approaches and perceptions are very different. I think it's sometimes very difficult for outsiders to kind of understand that. Yes,
no, very true. It's a lot of victims hide it too, because there's shame involved as well to be seen as a victim. And so people are like, oh, look, but they're still together, still talking, then she should be fine. But sometimes you have to play the game to appease that abusive partner, because, your life is on the line.
Absolutely.
So,
and it's your life, it's also your children.
Yes.
Children complicate the situation for a lot of spouses, because, you do have to keep in mind, well, there are cultural forces, for example, saying, it's better to stay together for the children. It's not.
No.
But it's hard to get over those sort of things that you have grown up with, those beliefs that you've.
Yeah, no, very true. So Noor Family Services. So if someone was to reach out to them, a victim of domestic violence, what services do they provide?
So the services begin with the initial intake and safety planning. So the initial intake will involve a safety planning, make sure that the victim is in a safe place, but also plan for how to get that victim or survivor in a safe space, right? Mm-hmm. We want to make sure that whatever is happening, it happens systematically so that we are not creating a situation that is worse for the client than when they call. So safety planning, but beyond the safety planning, we will figure out what kind of resources do you need. Is it that you need assistance with finding shelter? And if so, they'll give referrals or assist with housing. Do you need assistance with transportation? So Noor Family Services does assist with that. Is it that you have just now established a separate household and need help paying bills? In certain situations, NFS clients also qualify for those services. Food, we do have a food pantry, gift cards for food or for gas. Those are things that that NFS will routinely provide to their clients. And then beyond that, do you need legal assistance, right? And I think that's where we're a little bit different in that we do have contracted staff attorneys who work with the organization. And basically, when a client calls in and says, hey, I have an ex parte TPO, I have a hearing in 3 weeks and I don't have an attorney, well, we have an attorney that we know that we can connect you with. And it's not just one, it's multiple attorneys that NFS works with. So they'll connect you to an attorney to assist with the temporary protective order. I think where we really sort of step aside from other organizations is that beyond the temporary protective order, a lot of clients need assistance with other kinds of stuff as well, right? Because it doesn't always end with the TPO. So if the client is in an abusive relationship and wants to leave that abusive relationship, we can assist with that. So our attorneys are able to assist with divorce and, obtaining the necessaries, like, for example, child support. How do you get child support instituted so that you have the ability to provide for your children? So our attorneys will assist with direct family law services involving child support, divorce, if you want to do separate maintenance or legitimation. Those are all kinds of family law services that we provide. So we currently do not have on staff somebody who does immigration anymore, but we will also connect you if the client needs assistance with immigration services. NFS will do those referrals as well and connect the client to somebody who can assist.
If there's a listener out there who's a victim of one of these versions or forms of domestic violence, what is the safest way they can reach the organization, and how will them contacting you be kept confidential for their own safety?
Right. So NFS takes confidentiality very, very seriously. We have strict confidentiality protocols. If you come into our office, you have to sign a confidentiality agreement so that those addresses are not shared. We will not confirm or deny that you're a client of the organization. We don't have that authority to do so. So that's one thing. But as far as what's the safest way to get in touch with us, first of all, if you're in an unsafe situation, if you feel that your life is being threatened or you are under threat of physical danger in that very moment, the first thing to do is call 911, because 911 is able to provide that emergent service. But we are available by phone. You can get our information from our website. You can contact us by email. You can contact us through social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook. Noor Family. So our website is www.noorfamilyservices.org. You can email info@noorfamilyservices.org, or you can call the call the organization. And that phone number, I should know off the top of my head, but I don't
remember numbers anymore either off the top of my head. But I'll definitely share all this information on when I post this episode on my Instagram and my social medias.
It's 470-589-7751.
Okay, wonderful. Good to know. Good to have. Divorce is hard already when there is no abuse even in that relationship. I can't imagine that the people who are in these abusive, like how they can see light on the other side of the tunnel, that maybe they're like, it's maybe better just to settle. Maybe it's the safest. How will I ever, make a life for myself, a living for my future, even especially when there's kids involved as well. Have you seen your victims overcome their situations and thrive afterwards?
Absolutely. Every day we see it. It's never easy. I'm not going to say that it's easy. There's nothing easy about leaving an abusive relationship.
No.
There's nothing easy about divorce.
No.
Even the best case scenario, it's not easy. There is a multitude of emotions involved. And then once you get past the emotions, you have a multitude of logistical and financial issues involved.
Yeah.
So there's nothing easy about the process. I do want to put that out there. And it's very, very difficult. But with the right support, it is absolutely possible. And that's really what Noor Family Services is there for, is to provide that support, to give you the ability to sort of buoy yourself for a period of time so that you are not drowning. And that's really what it feels like when it's so overwhelming to leave that relationship that it can be, you feel like you are drowning. But absolutely, we see it every day. I'm so amazed on a daily basis by so many of our NFS clients who have retained this amazing ability to put themselves back together again. Wow. Over and over again. It is really a thing of amazing beauty. It really is. But again, it is not something that is always pretty to watch. It can be a very difficult process and sometimes a very long process, but there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
Always.
There's this one little quote I read somewhere. It's like, divorce is hard, marriage is hard, pick your hard. So, both is going to be a struggle, but at the end, like you say, and I've met a couple that have come out of it, and it's just amazing the strength that they have, and to have that hope. It's that hope and that faith that keeps them going, and they do get to that point. So what advice, tip, or recommendation would you give those who are scared or have doubt to seek help?
I think that the best advice that I can give them is, believe in yourself, right? I think it's sometimes very difficult to do that when you're in a dark situation and you think that there's no way out. But I guarantee if you reach out for help, help is there. Mm-hmm. It is just a matter of believing in yourself and knowing that you can step out of this mire and find a way out. There are a lot of resources out there, and you have to put yourself first. You have to prioritize yourself. And it's not really just for yourself either. You have to prioritize yourself for your children. Mm-hmm. Honestly, you have to prioritize yourself. And when you do, there's such a wealth of information and resources out there. Sometimes that in itself can be overwhelming, but talk to someone. There are lots of listening ears and helping hands if you reach out for it.
Thank you so much, Fakiha, for coming on and talking to us about this. I hope it helps anybody listening, that if they find themselves in this situation, they now know where to go and what amazing organization there is out there to assist them. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with us, and I definitely will post all this information of how to reach Noor Family Services.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nooshin. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate it.